The waiting room smelled like recycled air and old fear. Yusra Okafor Hale had been sitting in the same chair for 11 hours. The chair was bolted to the floor. Everything in Waypoint Kessler, 7, was bolted to something, as if the station itself was afraid things would float away if it stopped holding them down. She understood the feeling. Around her, the queue moved. It always moved. It just never got shorter. Durasi refugees sat in rows along the far wall. Most of them were children. They had the particular stillness of children who had learned that stillness was safer than movement, quieter than sound, less likely to draw attention from the wrong kind of eyes. They sat with their bags on their laps and their eyes on the floor and their hands very, very still. Yusra looked at her screen, looked at the form, looked at the field that said Times, sponsorship, documentation, primary homeworld, registration number. The Durasi homeworld no longer had a registration number. The compact had revoked the treaty. The treaty revocation had triggered an automatic deregistration. The deregistration had voided all homeworld-linked documentation. The documentation void meant the children in that row did not, technically, have a field to fill in. She typed into the field anyway. The system rejected it. She tried a workaround, a different field, a reclassification code she'd used twice before for edge cases. The system flagged it for review. Estimated review time, 90 days. She stared at that number for a long moment. 90 days was not a bureaucratic delay. 90 days, in this waiting room, with no valid sponsorship documentation, with the Vagrancy Consolidation Act, now 3 weeks in effect. 90 days was something else entirely. She knew what it was. She just didn't say it, because saying it out loud in a transit station waiting room, in front of children who were already afraid, would not help anyone. She submitted the reclassification request anyway. She always did. She kept records. Records mattered. They mattered later, after everything, when someone finally looked. The harvesters arrived the next morning. There were 4 of them. They came through the service entrance, which meant they had service authorization, which meant someone had cleared them before they even walked in. They wore the gray and yellow of Reclaim Solutions Incorporated. Their equipment was clean. Their contractor badges were laminated. The lead one, a species Yusra didn't know well enough to read its face, carried a portable biometric scanner and a stack of collection orders that were, by every legal measure she could find in the next 4 minutes of frantic searching, completely valid. She searched anyway. She always searched. She kept records. Licensed contractor. Compact Vagrancy Consolidation Act. Clause 7. Subsection 12. Collection of unregistered biological units. Tier 4 classification and below. For processing and placement. Processing and placement. She had a list, somewhere in her files, of what that meant. She did not open the list. She already knew what was on it. The lead harvester walked to the Durasi row and began scanning. The children did not make noise. That was the worst part. They already knew, in the way children who have survived enough of the wrong things know, that noise would not help. The smallest one, a boy, maybe 9 years old, holding a piece of yellow fabric twisted around his fingers, watched the scanner move down the row, with eyes that were very large and very dry. He had already used up whatever crying he had. Yusra stood up. The lead harvester glanced at her. UN resettlement? He read it off her badge with the boredom of someone reading a weather report. Yes. You'll want to step back. Collection is in progress. I have reclassification requests pending on these individuals. Pending is not approved. He went back to scanning. You're welcome to follow up with the review board. She looked at his badge number. She looked at the issuing authority printed under it. She looked at it for longer than she needed to, because she already knew what she was seeing. But knowing and seeing were different things, and she needed the second one to make the first one real. The issuing authority was the Compact Bureau of Transit and Resettlement Operations, the same bureau that had issued her own credentials, her own badge, the laminated thing she wore every day that said she was authorized to help. Same office, same stamps, same legal body. One set of credentials to bring children in, one set of credentials to take them out. The room was loud with the specific silence of 40 people trying not to breathe wrong. Yusra stood in the middle of it. Her face did not move. It had learned, over many years and many rooms like this one, how not to move. She walked to the communication array at the far end of the room, the one reserved for official UN resettlement business. She put her badge to the reader. It beeped green. She was, after all, authorized. She opened an encrypted channel. She typed for about 40 seconds. She read it back once. She sent it. Behind her, the scanner beeped. Again. Again. She stood at the console for a moment after the message was sent. Not because she needed to. Just because she needed to. Then she went back to her desk, sat down, and opened the next intake form. The system was slow today. It was always slow. She waited for it to load, and she looked at the Durasi boy with the yellow fabric, and she did not think about anything except the next form. She had been drafting that message for 3 years. 14 words. She'd known the day would come. She had not known it would be today, in this particular room, with that particular boy looking at her, with those particular dry eyes. She had thought, somehow, it would feel like more of a decision when it finally happened. It had felt like breathing out. The harvesters collected 17 children that day. They had valid orders for all 17. Their documentation was correct. Their equipment worked. They filed their completion reports on time, in the right format, to the right office. The paperwork was very much in order. Yusra filed her reclassification requests. 11 of them. For the children still in the queue, the ones the harvesters hadn't reached yet. She cross-referenced every field. She used every workaround she knew. She found 2, the system hadn't closed yet, and she pushed forms through both of them until the gaps sealed behind her. Then she started on the next set. She would be here tomorrow. She would be here the day after. The message was already traveling, through encrypted channels and informal networks and the particular grapevine of people who had seen enough of this to recognize it at the very first step, before it gathered momentum, before the paperwork multiplied and the collection orders stacked up and the children got quiet and dry-eyed and very, very still. Someone would get the message. The right someone. She did not let herself think about whether it would be fast enough. That thought was a door she did not open during working hours. She opened the next form instead. The system, very slowly, loaded. Outside the reinforced windows of Waypoint Kessler, 7. The black between stars was the same as it always was. Enormous. Patient. Entirely indifferent to the paperwork happening inside a waiting room, bolted to a rock at the edge of compact territory. Yusra typed. The queue did not get shorter. She typed anyway. The bar had no name. Stations at the edge of compact territory rarely bothered. Dio Marchetti was on his 3rd drink when his comm buzzed. He did not look at it immediately. He had learned, over many years, in many bars on many stations he was not officially supposed to be on, that the difference between a message you could take your time with and a message you could not was usually obvious from the first word. He looked at the first word. He finished his drink. It was the last calm thing he did for 6 weeks. The message was from Yusra. 14 words. He read them twice, not because they were complicated, but because reading something twice was a habit from the years when missing a word got people killed. The words were not complicated. They were very simple. They were the kind of simple that lands in the chest and stays there. He put down his glass. He did not put it down hard. He put it down the way you put something down, when you are making sure your hands are free. He pulled up his contact list and started making calls. The first call was to a woman named Petra Solis, who ran a freight operation out of a mid-tier station and had once, 3 years ago, asked Dio a very specific question about Article 9 of the Human Accession Agreement. She had not explained why she was asking. He had not explained why he knew the answer. They had both understood the conversation perfectly. She picked up on the second buzz. Kessler, 7, Dio said. A pause. Not a long one. How many? 40, minimum. Probably more by the time we arrive. I have a cargo hold. Another pause. It needs some work before it's appropriate for people. How long? 12 hours if I stop sleeping. Stop sleeping, Dio said. She had already hung up. The second call was to an old compact peacekeeper named Rennick, who had resigned the same week Dio had, 4 years ago. for reasons neither of them had ever discussed out loud. They had met once, briefly, at a tribunal hearing neither of them was supposed to attend. They had sat 2 rows apart, and not spoken. They had both watched the same thing happen to the same group of people, and they had both walked out of that room changed in the same direction. Rennick picked up on the first buzz, which meant he had been waiting. "I heard," Rennick said. "The act has been running for 3 weeks. I know. It's going to accelerate. I know." A sound that might have been a chair. "What's the angle?" Article 9. Human ward registration. I need someone who can hold a room while paperwork processes. That's a short window. It only needs to be long enough. Rennick said nothing for a moment. Dio had learned to read his silences. This one meant times. Yes, times. And also times. I've been ready for this. Times. And also something older than both of those things that neither of them would ever put into words. "I'll be there in 30 hours, Rennick said. The calls kept going. 12 in total. A ship captain who owed Dio nothing but showed up anyway, because she had a daughter, and her daughter had been born on a station, and she understood what it meant for a child to exist without the right paperwork. A legal clerk who had spent 7 years inside compact treaty law and knew exactly which clauses had been written carelessly. A medic. 2 engineers. A former compact border officer who had quit on a Tuesday and never said exactly why. Each call lasted between 40 seconds and 4 minutes. Each person answered the same way, not with surprise, but with the sound of someone picking up a weight they had been setting down and picking up and setting down for years, and this time deciding to just carry it. Humans had a word for this network. They had several words, actually, and none of them were official. It had no headquarters, no funding structure, no command hierarchy. It had existed in different forms, for as long as humans had been in the compact, which was long enough to understand that being tier 6 inches a 9, tier system meant you were protected just enough that nobody felt bad about what happened to you. The network knew things. It remembered things. The compact had 300 years of institutional memory. Humans had 6,000 years of a different kind of memory, the kind that lives in the body, in the gut, in the instant recognition of a document that looks like help but is shaped like a trap. Dio had been inside the compact peacekeeping forces for 8 years. He had followed legal orders. He had, twice, been part of operations that were lawful under the tier system and that he still thought about at 3 in the morning when the bar had no more drinks in it. He had resigned the same week Rennick had, for the same reason, without knowing about Rennick. He did not think about that now. He thought about the briefing instead. In a back room on a station with no name, 12 hours later, he laid it out. Clean. Simple. No extra words. The harvesters had valid licenses. They would keep collecting until something stopped them. Legal challenge would take 90 days minimum, and the compact tribunal moved like it had somewhere better to be. Direct physical obstruction was a criminal act under compact law. Article 9, however, said something specific. Human personnel were authorized to detain individuals who posed a direct threat to registered human wards. It was a clause from the original accession agreement, written in the early days when nobody expected humans to use it for anything serious. Nobody had read it carefully enough. Yusra had filed ward registration forms that morning. Retroactive registration. 40 children, registered as human-sponsored wards at exactly the moment the harvesters made contact. The harvesters, by attempting to collect registered human wards, were now legally threatening registered human wards. Article 9, activated. The window was short. The compact would challenge it fast, but the challenge would go to a tribunal, and the tribunal was 6 weeks out, and 6 weeks was long enough to move 40 children to somewhere that was not a processing facility. Someone in the room asked, "Will this hold up at tribunal?" Dio looked at them. "Doesn't need to hold up," he said. "Needs to hold long enough." The room was quiet for a moment, with the specific quiet of people who understand a plan, and also understand its cost, and are choosing to pay it anyway. They moved out in 2 hours. Dio was the last one to leave the back room. He stood for a moment at the table, where the briefing materials were still laid out. Intake forms, photos, case files, standard refugee documentation. He stopped at one photo without meaning to. A Durasi boy. 9 years old in Durasi years, which was about 14 in developmental terms, which was to say he was a child by every measurement that mattered, holding a piece of yellow fabric in the photo, fingers wrapped around it like it was a rope. The case file said the fabric was from his homeworld, technically, the one that no longer had a treaty, a registration number, or a legal identity in the compact system. Dio had put a child in a labor facility once, 4 years ago. Legal, fully compact sanctioned, Tier 3 classification, unregistered, collected under a predecessor act that had since been amended, but not before it was used, 47 times. He did not think about that. He thought about the yellow fabric. He picked up his bag. He turned off the light. He walked out to the corridor, where the others were waiting. They had a long way to go and a short time to get there, and he was very good at that particular problem. He had been practicing for years. The loading bay of Waypoint Kessler, 7, was large enough to park 4 transport ships and still have room left over for the kind of bureaucratic activity that required witnesses and documentation and the loud, specific confidence of people who believed paperwork was armor. The harvesters believed that very much. There were 6 of them today. More than yesterday. The operation was scaling up because the operation was going well. The transit station's security office had cleared them. The collection orders were valid. The biometric scanner was charged and working, and the children in the processing queue were, as of this morning, still unregistered by any authority that the compact legal system was required to care about. The lead harvester, the one with too many teeth and a contractor badge that caught the light, was explaining the process to a Durasi child who did not understand the language and did not need to understand it to know what was happening. The child stood very still. They were all very still, the children in the bay. 23 of them, collected over 2 days, lined up, quiet, holding whatever they had managed to keep. The boy with the yellow fabric was at the end of the line. The bay doors opened. Yusra Okafor Hale walked in first. She walked the way she always walked, not fast, not slow, exactly the pace of someone who knows where they are going and sees no reason to perform urgency. Behind her came 7 humans. Dio was one of them. He was positioned slightly behind her and slightly to the left, which was where he always stood when the situation was the kind of situation where standing slightly behind and slightly to the left was the professional choice. The lead harvester looked up from his scanner. He read Yusra's badge with the same bored precision as before. UN resettlement. He did not make it a question. You don't have jurisdiction in a licensed collection zone. I have a legal injunction. She held up a document. Paper. Actual paper. Printed and signed. Because paper was harder to remotely flag and delete than a digital file. Filed this morning with the Compact Transit Authority. Waypoint Kessler. 7 Regional Office. The lead harvester looked at the paper. He had the expression of a person who has never had to take paper seriously and was not sure he needed to start today. On what grounds? Article 9 of the Human Accession Agreement. These individuals are registered human-sponsored wards. She produced a second document. 40 pages, 1 per child. Registration was filed and confirmed at 0600 this morning. A pause. That registration is retroactive, the harvester said. It was filed after collection began. It was filed before collection was completed. The Act does not specify a window. The legal burden is on the collecting party to verify ward status before completing collection, not before initiating it. She tilted her head slightly. You might want to check with your legal team. The harvester's too many teeth showed in a way that was probably an expression, though not a friendly one. These individuals are Tier 4 classification. Human ward registration does not override compact tier law. It does not. But it does trigger Article 9 protections, which authorize human personnel to detain individuals, posing a direct threat to registered human wards. She said it the way she said everything, quietly, completely without heat. The way someone reads a tide table. You are currently in physical contact with registered human wards. That makes you an active Article 9 threat. The loading bay was very quiet. The lead harvester looked at his team. His team looked at him. There was a conversation happening between them that did not use words. The kind of conversation that happens when a plan that was working 30 seconds ago has developed a new and inconvenient shape. Then he pulled his compliance weapon. It was a standard compact contractor model used for crowd management, technically non-lethal. Technically. He raised it at no one in particular, which was the threat, the gesture, the armor of a man who had spent a career in spaces where this was enough. Deo took it. He did not draw his own weapon. He did not step forward dramatically. He simply moved, the way a person moves when they have done a thing so many times that it has stopped requiring thought, and his hand closed around the compliance weapon, and he took it out of the harvester's grip the way you take a pen from someone who was borrowing it, and now you need it back. He held it. He looked at it briefly, like it was mildly interesting. He put it in his jacket pocket. The lead harvester stared at the space where his weapon had been. Article 9. Dio said. It was the only thing he said. The children were moved. All 23 in the bay, plus the 17 from the previous day whose location Yusra had tracked through the station's internal transfer logs, which she was authorized to access, and had been accessing every hour since yesterday morning. All 40. It took 41 minutes. Petra Solis's cargo hold was ready. The ship was docked at Bay 7. Everything was where it needed to be. The harvesters were detained under Article 9 as active threats to registered human wards. The detention was legal. The forms were filed in real time by the legal clerk who had spent 7 years inside compact treaty law and knew exactly how long each form needed to be. The nearest compact tribunal authority was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks. During 6 weeks, contractor licenses were suspended pending review. During 6 weeks, children could be moved to a place that was not a processing facility. During 6 weeks, the network could find the next station and the one after that, and start filing ward registrations before the harvesters arrived, instead of during. The lead harvester, standing with his hands being formally documented by Rennick, said it without particular anger. He said it the way a person states a fact they believe to be structurally true, and therefore comforting. You understand this changes nothing. The act is still law. We'll be released. Yusra was walking toward the cargo bay. She did not stop walking. I know, she said. She said it without turning around, without slowing down, without any inflection that suggested it was anything other than a straightforward acknowledgement of a straightforward truth. She knew. She had always known. The act was still law. The compact was still the compact. The tribunal would still run slow. The tier system would still exist. All of that was true, and none of it changed what was happening right now in this loading bay, which was that 40 children were being walked to a ship, and the ship was going to leave, and they were going to be on it. That was all she was doing. Right now. This one thing. Tomorrow she would file more forms. She would find more gaps. She would register more wards. She would push forms through every opening the system hadn't sealed yet, and some it thought it had. She would be here tomorrow. In the cargo hold, the children were settling against the walls. The hold was clean. Petra had done good work. It smelled like recycled air, and something that was not fear, something quieter, something that might have been the early edge of the feeling that comes after fear, once the running has stopped, when the body has not yet decided if it can rest. The boy with the yellow fabric sat against the far wall. Deo came into the hold to do a head count. Standard procedure. He moved through the rows, counting. He was on 38, 39. When he got to the boy looked up at him. Dio did not know what his face did. He did not have a mirror, and he would not have looked at it if he had. The boy did not move away. Deo finished the count. 40. He marked it on his comm. He went back to the door and stood there with his back to the hold, looking out at the loading bay where his people were finishing the paperwork. 40. He did not think about the number he had filed once, legally, under a predecessor act, for a different species, in a different bay, 4 years ago. He thought about 40. He thought about the ship leaving, the bay door sealed, the engines started. Somewhere behind him, in the hold, a child made a small sound, not crying. Not quite. Something between relief and disbelief, the sound a person makes when they realize the thing they were bracing for did not happen. The ship left the station. Outside, the black between stars held everything with equal indifference. It did not care about the compact. It did not care about Tier 4 classifications or contractor badges or the paperwork stacked on desks in a transit waiting room. But the ship was moving, and the children were on it. That was enough. For today, it was enough. The compact tribunal chamber on Station Meridian 3 was designed to make people feel small. This was not an accident. The Varric had built it 300 years ago, and the Varric understood that the right ceiling height could end an argument before it started. The chamber ceiling was 40 meters up. The seats for the observing delegations were tiered in a long curve, looking down at the floor where the speakers stood. The floor was pale stone, polished to the point where you could see yourself in it, which meant you were always, technically, looking at yourself while you argued. Yusra had looked at herself in that floor for 6 weeks before today. She had thought about what she was going to say. She had thought about it very carefully and had arrived at the conclusion that she was not going to say what she had planned to say. She was going to say something else entirely. Ambassador Preth Voss delivered the compact's position from the upper tier. He was old, even by Varric standards, which meant his scales had gone the particular gray of age, and his voice had the weight of someone who had been in rooms like this one for longer than most species had been in the compact. He spoke for 40 minutes. He was precise. He was measured. He cited 14 separate treaty clauses and 4 legal precedents, and the structural importance of the tier classification system to the stability of compact governance. He was not wrong about a single individual fact. That was the thing about Preth Voss. He was never wrong about individual facts. He was only wrong about what the facts added up to. When he finished, the tribunal chair, a Solveth, species neutral by treaty obligation, turned to the human delegation. Yusra stood up. She did not bring prepared remarks. She brought a data file. She transferred it to the room's display system. The system loaded it. The room waited. She began to read. Names, ages, homeworlds, last known status, Ven Sira, estimated age 9, Durasi reckoning, homeworld, Durasi prime, treaty status revoked, last known status, cargo hold transit, waypoint Kessler, 7, current status, provisional ward, Nairobi orbital registration. She read clearly. Not fast, not slow. The same pace she used for everything. The pace of someone for whom the words were the point, and the performance was not. Kethomora, estimated age 11. Homeworld, Durasi prime, last known status. Processing queue, contractor collection, waypoint Kessler, 7. The tribunal chair raised a hand at the 20-minute mark. Delegate Okafor Hale. The tribunal recognizes the purpose of this recitation. But I have the floor under Article 14, Yusra said. She did not raise her voice. I have the right to complete my testimony. A pause. She had looked up Article 14 6 weeks ago. It was a clause from the original Compact Charter, written to protect minority delegations from being cut off before they had finished making their case. Nobody had used it for a full testimony in 40 years, because nobody had needed to. The tribunal chair lowered his hand. She kept reading. At the 1-hour mark, 3 Varric observers left the chamber. She noted their exit. She kept reading. At the 2-hour mark, the lead harvester's legal representative filed an objection. The tribunal reviewed it. The tribunal overruled it. She kept reading. At 4 hours, she reached the last name. Oresa Thal. Estimated age 7. Homeworld, Jurasi prime. Last known status. Processing queue, unresolved. Current status, unknown. She paused for 1 second on that last line, not for effect, because Oresa Thal's file was still open, because that child was still somewhere in the compact system and had not yet been found. Then she closed the file. 1,412 names, she said, collected under the Vagrancy Consolidation Act in the first 6 weeks of its operation. The Compact's legal position is that this collection was orderly, lawful, and consistent with tier classification standards. She looked up at the upper tier, where Preth Voss sat. "We don't dispute that. We are simply making sure there is a record." The chamber was very quiet. Preth Voss, to his credit, did not look away. The harvesters were released, as promised. Their licenses were reinstated. Their documentation was valid. The ward registrations were challenged, reviewed, and partially overturned. The retroactive element was found to be procedurally irregular, which was a polite way of saying the tribunal was not going to let that particular trick work twice. The humans had expected this. 2 days after the tribunal session, the human delegation filed a new instrument. It was called a Protective Interest Declaration. The Compact's legal historians spent 3 hours searching their records before confirming that while the instrument was theoretically valid, no species had ever used it before, because no species had ever had reason to, or had thought to, or had arrived in the Compact with the particular kind of institutional memory that made you think to look for it. The declaration stated, in the precise language of Compact legal code, any contractor, individual, or entity that collects, detains, transports, or processes an unregistered juvenile biological unit within a human-accessible corridor will be considered an active threat to human-registered wards and subject to Article 9 detention, pending tribunal review. Tribunal review took, on average, 14 months. During tribunal review, contractor licenses were suspended. During contractor license suspension, licensed collection operations could not legally proceed. It was not a ban. It was not a direct legal challenge to the Vagrancy Consolidation Act. It did not overturn the tier system. It did not do any of the things a formal legal challenge would do, with all the delays and review periods and opportunities for the Compact to find the clause that made it not work. It was not a wall. It was a tax. Every time a harvester entered a human-accessible corridor, and humans were the 5th largest contributor to Compact transit infrastructure, which meant human-accessible corridors covered approximately 60% of Compact space. They were risking 14 months of suspended operations. The Compact's legal scholars spent 3 days looking for the clause that prevented this. There wasn't one. The accession agreement had been written in the early days, when humans were new and small, and nobody had sat down to think carefully about what the Article 9 provisions would mean if humans decided to apply them expansively. It had seemed unnecessary. Humans were Tier 6. They had 2 seats. They would not be a problem. Nobody had read it carefully enough. Preth Voss, in a private message to his home council that he sent the night after the declaration was filed, wrote with the considered language of someone trying very hard to be fair to a situation that confused him. He wrote that the human delegation was not emotional, that they had not been angry in the chamber, had not threatened, had not made demands beyond what the law technically permitted, that they had simply read names for 4 hours and then filed paperwork. He wrote that this was, somehow, more concerning than anger. He wrote, "They are not angry. That is what concerns me. Anger resolves. This is something else." He did not have a word for what it was, exactly. His language had words for grief and rage and righteousness. It had words for cold calculation and for vengeance and for the long game played by civilizations with centuries to spend. It did not have a word for the specific thing humans did. The thing that was not quite any of those, but had elements of all of them. The thing that looked like patience but was not patient, because patience implies waiting, and humans were not waiting. They were working, every day, in transit waiting rooms and tribunal chambers, and encrypted channels and back rooms on stations with no names, filing forms, building networks, registering wards, finding the 14-word message worth sending, and sending it before the situation gathered the momentum that made it unstoppable. They had seen that momentum before. They had lived inside it, on their own planet, inside their own history, for long enough to know what it looked like when it was still small. Yusra had not explained this in the chamber. There was no point in explaining it. The record was the explanation. The names were the explanation. The Protective Interest Declaration was the explanation. She went back to Waypoint Kessler, 7 the following morning. The queue was longer than the week before. She opened the first form. She started typing. 14 months later, Waypoint Kessler, 7 smelled the same. Recycled air. Old floors. The particular stillness of a waiting room that has been a waiting room for so long. It has stopped being anything else. The seats were still bolted to the floor. The intake forms were still slow to load. The queue still did not get shorter. But the harvesters were not there. They had stopped coming to human-accessible corridors 8 months ago. Not because the Vagrancy Consolidation Act had been repealed. It had not been repealed. It was still law. It was still valid. Children of Tier 4 classification and below were still legally collectible under compact code. The math had just changed. 14 months of suspended operations was not, by itself, financially ruinous for a large contractor. But 14 months per incident, across 60% of compact space, across an unknown number of potential Article 9 triggers that could be filed by any human personnel at any time, in any corridor, that was a different equation. The risk was unquantifiable. The compact's insurance bodies had started adjusting their premiums for human corridor operations. 3 of the largest harvester firms had quietly shifted their focus to corridors where humans were not present. The network kept filing ward registrations, proactively now, not retroactively, before the harvesters arrived, not during. They had learned the timing. The Protective Interest Declaration had been formally invoked 11 times. 11 contractors were in holding facilities, pending tribunal review, licenses suspended. The compact called it a destabilization of established legal frameworks. They said it in measured tones, in official communications, with the careful language of institutions that believe that if they say something calmly enough, it will be received calmly. Humanity's response was delivered by Yusra Okafor-Hale in a statement that was 40 seconds long. We're aware of the compact's concerns. We take them seriously. That was the whole statement. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The declaration was still active. The Article 9 detentions were ongoing. The ward registrations were being filed every day, in every human-accessible corridor, by a network that had no headquarters and no official funding, and no formal chain of command, and had been quietly building itself for the entire time humans had been in the compact. The compact was a coalition of 40 species. It had 300 years of experience in governance. It had legal frameworks that had survived wars and collapses, and the rise and fall of member civilizations. It was, by any reasonable measure, an enormously powerful institution. It had not been built to handle this specific thing. It had been built to handle formal challenges, legal arguments, species that pushed back through official channels and could be managed through official responses. It had procedures for conflict. It had procedures for resistance. It did not have a procedure for 40 humans in transit waiting rooms filing forms every day until the cost of the alternative became impossible to calculate. Preth Voss had asked, in a later private communication, what it would take to reach an agreement, what humans wanted, what the endpoint of this was. The human delegation's response had been delivered by a junior legal clerk, which was itself a kind of answer. The response said, repeal of the Vagrancy Consolidation Act, full personhood protections extended to Tier 4 and below juvenile classifications, and a formal review of the tier system's application to displaced populations. The compact was still considering it. The network kept filing. Venn was bad at 3 languages. He had been bad at them when he arrived at Kessler, 7, and he was still bad at them now, 14 months later, in a learning program in the Nairobi orbital belt, where he sat in the back of a classroom and mixed up his verb conjugations and sometimes used the wrong alphabet halfway through a sentence because he had learned parts of all 3 languages at the same time under circumstances that were not ideal for retention. His instructor had told him, twice, that it was fine. That language learning took time. He did not know if he believed that. He was not sure he cared, exactly. What he cared about was that the room had windows, that the windows looked out at the orbital, at the slow movement of ships and the far edge of the planet below, that no one had scanned him since he left Kessler. 7. That the chair he sat in was not bolted to the floor. He still carried the yellow fabric. It had been with him on his homeworld, on the transport, in the waiting room, in the cargo hold, in every room he had been in since the place it came from had stopped existing. It was frayed now at one edge, the threads pulling loose. He had not repaired it. He did not know how. He kept it in his left pocket. He did not take it out in class. He did not take it out around people he did not know. Sometimes, when the room was empty and the windows were showing something good, a freighter passing close, the slow turn of the orbital, he put his hand in his pocket and held it. That was all. Dio was in a bar. It was a different bar from the one 14 months ago, on a different station. But it had the same quality of anonymity, the kind of place that did not keep records, and did not ask why you were there at this particular hour, with that particular expression. He was on his second drink when the Jurassic trader sat down across from him. He did not know the trader. He had never seen him before. The trader was adult, working age, wearing the vest of a freight certification that meant he moved goods through legitimate channels and paid his compact transit fees on time. Free, in other words. Not a ward, not a reclassified unit, not a case file. A person with documentation, moving through the galaxy the way documented people moved. The trader put a drink in front of Dio. He did not say anything. He stood up. He left before Dio could open his mouth. Dio looked at the drink for a moment. He picked it up. He thought about whether it meant something. He thought about whether the trader had a story he would never know. A transit waiting room. A cargo hold. A network that moved in the dark and filed paperwork and showed up in loading bays with legal injunctions and too much knowledge of treaty clauses. He thought about that for a long moment. Then he stopped thinking about it and just drank the drink, because the trader was gone and the drink was there, and some things did not need to be turned into a meaning in order to be real. Yusra filed the morning intake forms at 0700. The queue had 43 people in it. That was 5 more than last week. A homeworld treaty had collapsed on the far side of the compact 3 weeks ago. Not Jurassic, a different species, a different bureaucratic disaster with the same shape, and the ripple was arriving now in transit waiting rooms and intake queues. She opened the first form. She typed. The system was slow. It was always slow. She waited for it to load, and she looked at the queue, at the people sitting with their bags on their laps, and their eyes forward, and their hands carefully still, and she did not think about the 4-hour testimony, or the 11 contractors in holding, or the 40-second press statement, or the message that had been 14 words, and had taken 3 years to write. She thought about the next form. She would be here tomorrow. The system loaded. She typed. Outside the windows of Waypoint Kessler, 7. The same black between the same stars held everything with the same indifference it had always had. It did not care about the compact. It did not care about tier classifications, or ward registrations, or declarations filed in the language of institutions that had not been built to handle the thing they were now handling. The queue was 43. Yusra typed. The compact had 300 years of experience governing small species. Humans had one policy. Not here, not today, not one. It was not a law. It was not a formal declaration. It was not a doctrine with a name or a command structure or a funding line. It was a temperature, and it did not cool.